The Soviet Union, as a matter of practical fact, as everybody knows, that's got courage to face the fact, the practical fact known to you and known to all the world, is run by a dictatorship. A dictatorship as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world. It has allied itself with another dictatorship, and it has invaded a neighbor so infinitesimally small that it could do no conceivable possible harm to the Soviet Union.
The Winter War was a conflict that raged from November 30th, 1939 to March 13th, 1940. It was a war between the vast Soviet Union and the small Nordic state of Finland. The conflict began over territory that the Soviet Union desired in order to have a buffer between the Finnish border and its major city of Leningrad, and other small territorial changes. Against insurmountable odds, the Finns were able to hold back the Soviet advance and inflict heavy casualties on their enemy, in the end saving their country from coming under the grasp of the Soviet Union. The conflict, despite being mostly forgotten about, is a grand story of how a small country was able to defend itself and its people against what was seen as an unbeatable enemy. The year is 1939, just about 3 months before the Winter War is about to begin. The Soviet Union has just signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany. Just 1 month later, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany would perform a joint invasion of Poland. The Soviet Union would then send treaties to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of which would effectively make them client states. The Baltic states were forced to accept. All of these moves were done to strengthen the Soviet Union before the inevitable conflict between them and Nazi Germany. Next, Stalin began eyeing up the Soviet Union's neighbors and noticed Finland. Finland had recently come out of a brutal civil war, in which the nationalist Finnish Whites defeated the communist Finnish Reds. The new Finnish government, while under President Pierre Evans Finnvehud, had recently deemed the Communist Party of Finland illegal. These moves against communism in Finland worried Stalin. Stalin feared that, when Germany and the Soviet Union clashed, Finland would allow German troops to cross their borders in a direct route to the gates of Leningrad. However, despite all these anti-communist and pro-nationalist policies being passed, Finland declared neutrality whenever World War II broke out. Finland did not want to come in conflict with the Soviet Union and risk utter annihilation. The Soviet Union had the largest military in the world at the time, while Finland had very little military to speak of. This policy of neutrality didn't sit well with Stalin, because the fear of Leningrad being easily taken over and sieged was far too great. Stalin met with his generals to devise a plan on what to do with Finland. Initially, Stalin sent Finland a list of demands they could never accept. The demands were that Finland give 30 kilometers or 19 miles of their border west of a town called Vyborg to the Soviet Union. Finland destroy all existing fortifications in the Karelian Isthmus. Finland cede all of the islands in the Gulf of Finland to the Soviet Union. Finland leased the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviet Union for 30 years and permit the Soviet Union to build a military base there. And in exchange, the Soviet Union would cede Ripola and Porjärvi municipalities to Finland. These municipalities were twice the size of the territory Finland would cede, but were much less useful. The Finnish parliament rejected the offer, and all other counter-offers by the Finnish government were rejected by the Soviet Union. During negotiations, the militaries of both the Soviet Union and Finland began amassing at the border. The Soviet Union and Finland began drawing up plans for the upcoming war. Initially, the Soviet Union's plans were a strong push through the Karelian Isthmus and into the heavily populated and strategically crucial southern coast of Finland. However, these plans were scrapped and replaced with a more complicated and impressive plan. These changes were made, in part, because of the invasion of eastern Poland just months before. Stalin wanted to put on an impressive show of military might to the rest of the world, instead of opting for a simple and quick invasion plan like they had chosen to do in their invasion of Poland. This choice would have disastrous side effects later on. The new plans were estimated to only take 2 weeks before the Finns would capitulate and accept Soviet demands. And so, on the 26th of November, 1939, the Soviet Union conducted a false flag attack on the village of Mainila. 4 days later, the Soviet Union would officially declare war on Finland and send troops onto Finnish soil. As the Soviet Union advanced into Finnish territory, they established the Finnish Democratic Republic, a puppet government with the Finnish communist Otto Vilkuinen, who had fled during the Civil War, at its head. The implications were clear. The Soviet Union wanted to not only take over a part of Finland, but replace its government entirely with a puppet state. Finland's plan in the war was simple. Because they had almost no armored divisions to speak of and much fewer troops than the Soviet Union, they would use a strategy called Moti, which was to locate, isolate, and slowly whittle down the enemy through hunger, frostbite, and bullets. First, they would distract an enemy with small raids and guerrilla attacks. Then, they would encircle them with ski troops, and finally, the troops would slowly wear down the enemy, while the enemy slowly ran out of supplies. Finland also used effective camouflage to hide from their enemies, which cannot be said for Soviet soldiers that wore brown uniforms. These tactics were simple yet effective and would be the main reason why the Soviet Union suffered 5 times the casualties as the Finns did during this war. As the Soviet Union began their invasion, Finnish multi-tactics took their toll on the enemy troops. It didn't help that, because Stalin's generals were so certain of a quick victory, the Soviet troops only had 2 weeks of ammunition at their disposal. Soviet troops took heavy casualties and could not complete their objectives. Because of the purges, Soviet high command was full of very inexperienced commanders. Most commanders expected sheer numbers to win, and so they would send in large numbers of troops. The troops wouldn't have enough supplies, the troops would get surrounded, and they would eventually be killed off. Because so many Soviet troops died, the Finns were able to capture what little ammunition and guns were on the Soviet troops and redistribute the weapons to other Finns to help lessen the effect of Finnish weapons stockpiles lacking in number. They did this so much that the Finns ended the war with more supplies than they had at the beginning. When Soviet forces were not being encircled, they were fighting against a defensive line called the Mannerheim Line, named after Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, the leader of the Finnish forces during the Winter War. This defensive line was extremely effective when Soviet troops were funneled into it and slowly picked off. After months of extremely high losses, Stalin met with his generals to draw up a new plan for the war. In the end, they settled on a military plan similar to the original one, with a strong and quick invasion of the extremely populated southern coast of Finland. After this plan was implemented, the Soviet Union had much more success and caused Finland to capitulate. In the end, Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty, which forced Finland to cede most of Finnish Karelia, a very important economic area of Finland, all of the islands in the Gulf of Finland, parts of the Salla area, and other small areas of Finland. In addition, Finland will lease the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviet Union for 30 years, with an annual rent of 8 million Finnish marks. Although this war was ultimately a defeat for Finland, it was very important to not only them and their country, but it also had some very real consequences that directly affected some events in World War II and afterward. After this, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. This war influenced Finland to decide to invade alongside him in the Continuation War, in order to reclaim lost territory and gain new territory to the east. This would help Nazi Germany put Leningrad under siege for 4 years. This conflict saw even more Soviet and Finnish troops dead. After this conflict, Finland would be forced to cede more land to the Soviet Union and expel all German troops from their land. This would result in another war, but this time against Nazi Germany, which was called the Lapland War. Another side effect of this conflict is that, on the Eastern Front, Soviet troops would adopt some Finnish tactics while fighting Nazi Germany when winter rolled around. One of the last decently major consequences of the war is that, after it, Stalin began reorganizing the military due to its failure during this conflict. Although it was just a year before Operation Barbarossa began, every competent general that replaced a bad one was one more roadblock in the German advance that killed more men that Germany couldn't afford to lose. In conclusion, this war was a war for Finnish survival against a force that greatly outnumbered them. And although it was extremely costly for the Finns, they lived to fight another day. Finland was able to survive against the Soviet Union's forces and become its own state instead of becoming a puppet government of the Soviet Union.